This podcast may contain graphic and potentially upsetting content related to true crime and the paranormal. Listener discretion is advised. Hello, I'm Corinna Harridan. This is the Monday Night Review. Hello, Happy New Year. Welcome to the Monday Night Review 2025. This is episode 152. Can you hear the banging? There's been no banging until I pressed record, and now, of course, it's 5:10 on a Monday. Some banging has started, so I'm sorry if you can hear that. I hope you can't, but it's going to drive me slightly bonkers. How was your festive season? Whether you celebrate Christmas or not, the way Christmas Day fell this year means that I think a lot of us got 2 weeks off. Not me. I overcommitted this year, and so on Saturday, the 4th of January, it was my first day off for the Christmas period. And today was my second day off. I made my husband work from home today because I was like, I'm not taking your kids swimming. It is my second day off of Christmas. And though I was up working with horses 7 till 10 every day and then 2 onwards every day, and I was working on Christmas Day, doing community management, I was doing lots. It does mean that I had a brain break. Now, some people might know I'm a life coach. I'm one of those people that does a lot of things. And I always try and get people to take some time off. Not because everyone deserves time off, because they do, but because actually your brain works better if it's had a bit of a break. And when your brain doesn't have a break, it may feel like it's working at full speed, but it's probably not. And what I feel like is, because I was out in the freezing cold, all weathers, doing work with horses, and we had people staying. So I had people staying from the 25th to the 30th, and then my sister was staying. So they were up the hill at my mum's, so we were seeing them. I didn't do anything. Didn't do any makeup work, didn't do any skincare work, couldn't do any Monday Night Review work. I did read my Agatha Christie novel. Does that count? But I really wasn't, I wanted to be present. I wanted to be festive when I was home. Did a pretty spectacular job on our festive jigsaw. I don't mind telling you. But it means that I feel pretty raring to go on all other fronts right now. I feel like that's as close to a mental break as my little brain is ever going to get. I hope you all had a nice time off. Everyone has had the lurgy. My husband, I said to him, one of the deals of me doing all this work is when I come home stinking of horse and exhausted, I want it to be cheery, festiveness when I get home. He had the lurgy that everyone's got. He, for the first time in the 20 years that I've known him, I think for the first time has had antibiotics. I don't remember him ever having them in the last 20 years. And so he had antibiotics. He has felt grim. Sinusitis basically is how his lurgy has manifested itself. Another friend of mine's lurgy has manifested itself into a burst eardrum, which isn't fun. Everyone seems to have had it. So if you have had it, I hope that you've at least been able to take some time, put your feet up, listen to a podcast, because my goodness, podcasts got me through some pretty dark, cold, shoveling shit hours over the past couple of weeks. Now, I believe in the last episode, I promised you some spooky, rompy, festive stuff, and then obviously I mentally disappeared into a hole. I do want to stay true to my word, though, and today we're straddling true crime, history, spooky, weird stuff. Not really spooky, weird stuff, but hopefully you'll know what I mean. One of my first episodes was on Jamaica Inn, and I love Jamaica Inn. I love the book Jamaica Inn. I love Cornwall. Jamaica Inn ticked so many boxes for me, but if you've listened to that episode, and if you know anything about smuggling, you'll know there wasn't actually that much smuggling in Cornwall. And if you think about it, if you were going to smuggle somewhere, some goods in or out of England, would you choose somewhere as far away as Cornwall? No, you wouldn't. So today we're going to talk about a much more factually accurate story of smuggling. In the 18th century, smuggling was rife in England, driven by high taxes imposed on goods such as tea, brandy, rum, tobacco, and lace, and the government sought to generate revenue through customs duties. But these taxes made imported goods prohibitively expensive to many. This created a lucrative black market for smuggled goods, particularly in coastal areas, but not Cornwall, as we're led to believe, even though, it works so well, doesn't it? But actually, Kent and Sussex were real hotspots with their proximity to mainland Europe and extensive coastline of secluded beaches and coves. So from some places in Kent, you can see, on a clear day, France. So really, it's the best place to go from if you're trying to get goods in or out. And smuggling became a way of life for many in Kent, providing livelihoods for entire communities. Fishermen, farmers, and local labourers often participated either directly in the smuggling runs or indirectly by offering storage or transport for contraband. I would say that I live in a village that was one of the hubs for smuggled goods. So in the village, we have a number of houses that actually have either secret tunnels or like hidden, almost basements. We don't really have basements, making them actual basements. So like hidden things under houses. Quite exciting. We don't have one. We do have a basement, but it's not hidden. It's very prominent. For some, it was a necessity in difficult economic times. For others, it was an opportunity for profit. And it wasn't all rugged Cornishmen trying to make ends meet and, Kipling poems. And I loved the poem The Highwayman when I was young. It wasn't all romance and that. Government figures from 1782 estimated that a quarter of the vessels engaged in smuggling nationwide were based in Kent and Sussex, and half the gin smuggled into England was landed in Kent. In fact, it was so abundant in that area that there are many accounts of locals using gin to wash their windows. Kentish smuggling first grew from the illegal exportation of wool. So we often think about it of things like brandy coming in, but actually it all started because the government imposed real restrictions on the export of wool, which was our biggest export, and it would go to France and Italy to be made into coats. And the government wanted to make money on this, so they whacked loads of restrictions and taxes on it, and it became really difficult to make any money on it. So it became more profitable to smuggle it over to France and beyond. And that then morphed into other things being brought back in. So sea smugglers brought goods ashore, which is the process known as landing, and then inland gangs would take over to hide, distribute, sell, and basically run the goods up to the towns and places where they were going to be sold. So again, if you're in Cornwall and you want to get your goods to London, that's a hell of a long way. That's a long way, even now with roads. You do much better getting it into Sussex or Kent and getting it straight into London if you could. Hence many of the gangs had their base of operations in towns and villages miles from the sea, which you wouldn't expect, which is, again, where I live is about 45 minutes from the coast. So you wouldn't think it had anything to do with smuggling, really. But it really did. Kent's coastline encompasses muddy tidal creeks, sandy coves and short cliffs, long shingle beaches and brooding marshes. It not only made it very easy to get goods in and quite far inland, but very hard to patrol. This and the proximity to both France and London made Kent a much more suitable place for smuggling than Cornwall. The authorities, including customs officers and the military, faced significant challenges in curbing smuggling. Coastal areas, as I said, were difficult to patrol, and local populations often sympathised with, actively supported, or indeed had no choice but to support smugglers. And this created an environment where organised crime groups could flourish. And I mean organised crime. That's where I think we get confused with smuggling. Although, what's he called in Jamaica? Jem Merlin? Is that what he's called? He is obviously an unpleasant. He's not putting a romantic face on smuggling, but the fact that this is far more mafia-esque than it's given credit for, I think cannot be overemphasized. Operating from inland hubs strategically positioned along routes to London's main markets, these groups were notorious for their ruthlessness, often maintaining control over local communities through fear and intimidation. It got to the stage where goods could be moved in broad daylight without fear of being reprimanded because everyone was going to cover up and nobody was going to tell tales. And today we're going to talk about one of the most infamous of these groups, the Hawkhurst Gang. Sources for today's episode include smuggling.co.uk, Wikipedia, kentonline.co.uk, very good episode from The Rest is History on smuggling, and everything I'll put in the show notes. Much of the contraband that entered England across the sand and shingle coasts of Romney Marsh then had to be shipped on pack horses to London, and this would take them through the sleepy hamlet of Hawkhurst, 10 miles or so inland. And it was here, among the old barns and houses, using their base as the Oak and Ivy Inn, that one of the most organised and fearsome smuggling operations of the era emerged. Operating from around 1735 to 1750, the gang expanded its reach across Kent, Sussex, and even into London. Unlike smaller informal smuggling groups, the Hawkhurst Gang operated with the sophistication of a criminal syndicate, employing violence and intimidation to maintain control. This wasn't a ragtag gang of locals. This was big, organised, and they used extreme violence to keep control. They also used the Mermaid Inn in Rye as a secondary location where they sat with their loaded weapons on the table. They were quite brazen and in your face. It wasn't that they were necessarily the biggest or the baddest gang of smugglers. It was a case of location. There were all these landings at Romney Marsh. They sort of dominated that area. And because it was such a good place to land your contraband, it meant that you were kind of in their patch. The gang specialised in importing contraband such as brandy and tobacco from France and the Netherlands, and these goods were landed on isolated beaches and transported inland using pack horses and carts. Their network ensured distribution across southern England and beyond. And you know what one of the most sought-after items was? Tea. Seems so weird to think about it now, doesn't it? Because pretty much every house in England has tea bags. We're known for our tea. The gang's reputation for brutality set them apart. They used violence to silence informers, intimidate rivals, deter interference from customs officers. Stories of their cruelty spread fear in the region. If they wanted your horse, you either gave it to them or you would suffer the consequences. Maybe your crops would be destroyed, your children would disappear, you would disappear. They would come for you. The gang's leadership was highly organised, with figures like Arthur Gray and Thomas Kingsmill overseeing operations. They ensured discipline within the gang and ruthlessly enforced their authority. Arthur Gray was one of the principal leaders, and he was known for his charisma and ruthlessness. Thomas Kingsmill was one of a pair of brothers that led at various points, and he was a strategic thinker. He played a significant role in the gang's success, but also in its eventual downfall. And then you have George Ransley, who was another prominent member, and he was largely known as the enforcer. In 1740, riding officer Thomas Carswell and a party of dragoons found 750 kilos of smuggled tea in a barn in Etchingham and were taking it to Hastings in a cart. Riding officers were appointed to patrol the coastline in an attempt to suppress smuggling. But as I said, really hard job to do. James Stanford of the Hawkhurst Gang heard what was happening and collected about 30 men with horses and weapons, and after drinking some brandy to bolster their courage, they attacked Carswell's men at Silver Hill between Hurst Green and Roberts Bridge. Carswell was shot dead, and the soldiers were captured. One of the smugglers, George Chapman, was later executed and gibbeted in his home village of Hurst Green. So gibbeting is unpleasant and actually doesn't happen that often, but its usage rose at this time and in this area as an attempt to deter smuggling. And in a way, it did, sort of. So gibbeting is either mostly after death, a body would be hung either on a gibbet, so a sort of wooden structure, or in chains, often in the hometown of where the person was. So you would be hanged and then taken to your hometown and gibbeted, where your body would be hung on display for weeks at a time. Between 1747 and 1750, members of the Hawkhurst Gang were also gibbeted for crimes including smuggling and robbery. It's basically a way of making an example of someone in a rather gross way. Sometimes people would be gibbeted where you would just be hung out and left to die of starvation or exposure or thirst. Again, unpleasant. But by the late 1740s, the Hawkhurst Gang had developed unprecedented power and boasted that it could assemble 500 men in the space of a couple of hours. One of the most notable events from the Hawkhurst Gang, though, was on the 21st of April, 1747, when the village of Goudhurst, home to just 100 people, was transformed from quiet rural village in Kent to a scene from a western. The villagers had had enough, and 29-year-old local William Sturt, a soldier in Henry Harrison's regiment of foot, which would later be the 15th Foot, who had fought against the French at Ostend and recently been discharged from the army, decided to raise a militia against the smugglers. The Hawkhurst Gang heard of this and declared that they would come and burn the village to the ground. And in preparation for this, and while they waited for their numbers to gather, they went and drank a lot of brandy, which seems to be something that they did before doing stuff. And I guess there's a lot to be said for a bit of Dutch courage, but I think it was not really helping with their strategy in April 1747. Meanwhile, Sturt knows what he's doing. He is a great tactician. He had some of the buildings in the village fortified, and they used the Tower of St. Mary's Church as their observation point. That's up on high ground. So he knows that it's easier to hold high ground, that they're going to need some fortified places for the men to fight from. And the villagers armed themselves with whatever weapons they could find, including muskets, farm tools. They were ready to go. And Sturt trained them in basic defensive strategies and organised a plan to defend the village from an anticipated attack. Now, the exact history of what happened is vague, especially when it comes to numbers, but it's thought that there were about 27 members of the Goudhurst militia versus around 150 of the Hawkhurst Gang, led by Thomas and George Kingsmill. Now, the Hawkhurst Gang attack and are just flattened by the Goudhurst militia. The Goudhurst militia don't lose a man. The Hawkhurst Gang lose men. They have lots of men captured. They're in complete disarray. A lot of them turn and run off. They are just completely outdone. And it really shows people, actually, this reign of terror isn't as organised as we think it is. They're very good at this sort of nitty-gritty, horrible bit of organised crime. They're the kind of craze of the smuggling ring. But actually, when you face them with a strategy and training that they lose it. So a number of important members of the Hawkhurst gang were captured, including Thomas Kingsmill. George Kingsmill dies as part of this attack. Arthur Gray would later be executed at Tyburn in 1748, and he, along with fellow gang members William Farrell and Richard Perrin, and the bodies of Kingsmill and Farrell were then taken to Goudhurst and gibbeted in what is now known as Gore Lane. In all, about 75 members of the gang were tried and executed. Another famous story was that sometime in the early 1740s, Jeremiah Curtis, who'd been part of a violent gang in the Hastings area just along the coast, joined forces with the Hawkhurst gang and became one of its most brutal members. And it was Curtis who led the whipping and beating to death of Richard Hawkins, a farm labourer from Wolverton, who they had suspected of stealing 2 bags of the gang's tea. And he denied it. And they take him to the Dog and Partridge Inn in West Sussex to be interrogated, where he is just repeatedly whipped and beaten until he dies of his injuries. His body is later found weighted with rocks in a lake 12 miles away at Parham Park in the spring of 1748. One of the most infamous stories associated with the Hawkhurst gang, and really at the end of their time, because the Goudhurst militia really knocked them, and it gave other people, other communities, the power to start resisting the gang and stopping the intimidation. But one of the most infamous stories is basically a case of wrong place, wrong time, more than once. William Galley, a customs officer, and Daniel Chatter, a farmer, are involved in delivering evidence related to the trial of a captured gang member, John Diamond. As the Hawkhurst gang had passed through Fording Bridge in Hampshire, if you ever go, very beautiful, New Forest, John Diamond had been part of the gang, and he'd seen Chater, and they knew each other. They were friends, and he had waved at Chater and thrown him a bag of tea. And this celebrity went to Chater's head, and he started telling people around him how he knew John Diamond and that they were friends. And this got to the ear of local customs officers, and they wanted Chater to come and give evidence of all that he knew. Now, William Galley was tasked with transporting Chater and a letter about what he knew and what he was expected to do to a magistrate, Major Batten, in Chichester. And so they set off together. They get lost. It takes longer than they think. They have to stay overnight at an inn, and they drink a bit too much by all accounts. Again, it's rough history. And they either tell people what they're doing, or members of the Hawkhurst gang happen to be in the pub. And whatever happens, the Hawkhurst gang gets wind of these 2 men, and they intercept them. The 2 men are captured, bound, and subjected to horrific treatment. Galley's ordeal was particularly gruesome. He's beaten and tortured over several days. He's carried in a sack, slung over a horse, denied food and water. I believe he is dragged under a horse, so tied underneath a horse. The horse is then set off at speed, so you're dragged along the ground and kicked in the head by the horse. This eventually leads to his death, and then they focus on Chater. They imprison him in a well at an inn, leaving him without sustenance for days. They then tie him to a donkey and take him to a remote location where they torture him some more, and then they eventually throw him into a disused well and hurl rocks down on him to kill him. Now, the brutal murders of Galley and Chater sent shockwaves through the public and really marked a turning point in the fight against the Hawkhurst gang. These atrocities prompted authorities to intensify their efforts to dismantle the gang, and this is what linked to the execution of Arthur Gray and Thomas Kingsmill. Arthur Gray had been in, I believe, Maidstone prison at the time of the Hawkhurst attack, but was linked to this, and that's game over for him. The fall of the Hawkhurst Gang coincided with broader efforts to combat smuggling in England. The government increased resources for customs enforcement, including naval patrols and the establishment of revenue cutters. The Hawkhurst militia victory meant that communities felt able to begin to resist smuggling more actively, as its association with violence and crime tarnished its earlier romantic image. And it became that people in the villages were so poor because the smugglers needed money to get the goods that would later be paid for. It was having a real dire effect on these local communities. The legacy of the Hawkhurst Gang remains a significant chapter in the history of Kent and Sussex. Their exploits are remembered in folklore, but their story also serves as a stark reminder of the dark side of smuggling, a world of violence, greed, and ruthless ambition. You can go and see the Mermaid Inn in Rye is still open. The Oak and Ivy Inn in Hawkhurst was going to be reopened a couple of years ago, but I cannot find any evidence of that, so I don't know if it's again closed. But if you're in the area, you might as well have a look. And that is a very basic story of the Hawkhurst Gang. Had you heard of them? Did I ruin your ideas of smuggling? I would say that Kent and Sussex still get their fair share of things coming in from the coast, but it's more likely to be people and drugs than tea and brandy now. But I think it's so interesting. Obviously, if you live somewhere and you're local to it, you have a different idea. But you go to Cornwall and you go past Jamaica Inn and you think of it, it sort of has part of its traditions and histories based on smuggling, when actually it didn't really happen in Cornwall at all, but that's where, as we all associate it with. But think about Kent and Sussex. You can go and get extra episodes over on the Patreon. It costs you like less than a cup of coffee a month, I think. And you can either just get ad-free episodes for like £1 a month, or you can get all the extra episodes for a little bit more. You can get your merch through the link below. It's all in the description box. I put my favourite books on the bookshop.org just because I love independent bookshops, and it's really hard in the world of Amazon. And I'm very guilty of using Amazon. I wish I wasn't. But where I can, I try and buy secondhand, and where I can, I try and support local bookshops. So all books that I recommend, I have put hopefully in the bookshop link below. I love to hear from you, so email the mondaynighreview@gmail.com. I really want to know what episodes you've loved, what you'd like me to cover. Is there something weird near you? Is there a story that you think everyone should hear? Do you have a hometown murder? Do you have a weird thing that happens in your house? I really would love to hear from you and maybe tell other listeners your weird story or your hometown. And until next time, be kind, stay safe, and always